Take a deep breath and let your imagination carry you back more than 10,000 years to a world where medicine did not exist. A world where a simple cut could become a death sentence, where childbirth claimed countless lives, and where no one understood why people got sick. His name has been lost to history. He wasn't a king, a warrior, or a famous healer. He was simply a man trying to provide for his family. One afternoon, while chopping wood near his village, his axe slipped and sliced deep into his leg. At first, it didn't seem fatal. His family cleaned the wound the best they could. They wrapped it with cloth. They prayed. They waited. But the pain only grew worse. Fever soon took over his body. Day by day, he became weaker until he finally took his last breath, not because the wound was impossible to treat, but because humanity hadn't yet learned how, and he wasn't alone. Across the world, millions met the same fate. A broken bone, an infected cut, or even a simple fever could steal a life. This was the world before medicine. This is the story of how humanity began its greatest battle, the battle against death itself. For thousands of years, surviving an illness wasn't about finding a doctor, because doctors didn't exist. When someone collapsed with a fever or returned home badly injured, the entire tribe gathered around. There was no hospital to run to, no medicine to buy, no one was coming to save them. Their only hope rested in the hands of one person, the tribe's healer. Sometimes it was an elderly woman who knew every healing plant hidden deep within the forest. Sometimes it was a respected shaman believed to speak with the spirits. Whoever they were, the tribe trusted them with the most precious thing they had, life itself. They crushed leaves into pastes, boiled roots into bitter drinks, wrapped wounds with strips of animal skin, and searched nature for anything that might stop the pain. Some remedies truly helped, others did nothing at all. And many people died believing they had done everything possible. But something remarkable was happening. Every life they managed to save became a lesson. Every mistake became knowledge. Generation after generation, that knowledge was passed on, not through books because writing did not yet exist, but through stories, memory, and experience. Little by little, humanity was learning. For the first time in history, people were no longer simply accepting death. They were studying it, questioning it, searching for ways to defeat it. Humanity had finally taken its first step, but death was still far ahead. It would take thousands of years and millions of lives before humanity would finally begin catching up. Thousands of years passed. Small tribes grew into villages, and villages became great civilizations. With every generation, humanity learned a little more about the body and a little less about leaving everything to chance. Around 3000 BC, on the fertile banks of the Nile River, an Egyptian stoneworker cried out in pain after a sharp piece of rock sliced deep into his arm while building a temple. Only a few generations earlier, a wound like that could have slowly become infected and ended his life. But this time, something was different. He was taken to a physician. The doctor carefully washed the wound, covered it with honey to help protect it from infection, wrapped it in clean linen, and stitched the torn flesh together using simple bronze tools. Days later, the man was back on his feet. It wasn't a miracle. It was one of humanity's first real victories over death. The ancient Egyptians were becoming some of the world's first true medical pioneers. Instead of relying only on memory, they began writing their discoveries on papyrus scrolls. Treatments that had once lived only in the minds of healers could now be passed from one generation to the next. Every patient became another lesson. Every successful treatment became another piece of knowledge. Their understanding of the human body grew in another unexpected way. The Egyptians believed the dead should be preserved for the afterlife. During the careful process of mummification, they removed organs, examined muscles, and handled bones with extraordinary care. Without realizing it, they were slowly uncovering the secrets hidden inside the human body. Every body they prepared revealed something new. For thousands of years, surviving an injury had depended mostly on luck. But now, for the first time, survival was beginning to depend on knowledge. Humanity was no longer simply trying to ease pain. It was beginning to understand it. Yet Egypt was only the beginning. Beyond its deserts, other civilizations were asking the very same question. Why do people get sick? And can death itself be defeated? While the ancient Egyptians were slowly unlocking the secrets of the human body, another civilization was about to change medicine forever. Across the Mediterranean, in ancient Greece, a young boy lay burning with fever. His mother carried him to a temple, believing the gods had cursed her son. Priests offered prayers. Incense filled the air. Sacrifices were made. But the boy's fever only grew worse. For centuries, this was how many people understood disease. If someone became sick, it was often seen as the will of the gods, an evil spirit, or a punishment that no human could truly understand. Then, around 460 BC, one man dared to challenge that belief. His name was Hippocrates. He asked a question that sounded almost impossible for his time. What if sickness wasn't a punishment from the gods? What if every illness had a natural cause, one that could be discovered by careful observation? While others searched for curses, Hippocrates searched for clues. He watched his patients closely. He listened to their breathing. He studied their skin, their fever, their pain, and how their condition changed from one day to the next. Every patient became a puzzle waiting to be solved. One morning, a young fisherman was carried to him after collapsing with a violent fever. His terrified family believed the gods had chosen him to die. But Hippocrates didn't look toward the heavens. He looked at the man. He examined his breathing. He felt the heat of his skin. He asked when the sickness had begun, what the man had eaten, where he had traveled, and how the illness had changed. For perhaps the first time in history, a physician wasn't simply trying to cure a patient. He was trying to understand the disease itself. That simple change in thinking transformed medicine forever. Observation began replacing superstition. Questions began replacing fear. Little by little, knowledge began replacing centuries of guesswork. Hippocrates also believed that becoming a doctor meant accepting a great responsibility. A physician should never intentionally harm a patient. The duty of medicine was to heal whenever possible, to comfort when healing wasn't possible, and to place the patient's well-being above everything else. Those principles would later inspire what we now know as the Hippocratic Oath, a promise that still guides doctors more than 2,000 years later. For the first time, humanity stopped asking, which god caused this illness? And began asking, what caused it? And how do we stop it? That single question changed medicine forever. But great doctors alone couldn't protect an entire civilization. Medicine needed something even bigger. It needed clean water, safe streets, hospitals, a society built to keep people healthy. And no civilization would understand that better than Rome. As the Greeks transformed the way doctors thought, the Romans transformed the way an entire civilization stayed alive. They believed saving lives didn't begin at a patient's bedside. It began long before anyone became sick. One cold morning, a young Roman soldier collapsed onto the battlefield, clutching a deep wound in his arm. Blood soaked through his armor as his vision faded. He believed those next few moments would be his last. But instead of being abandoned where he fell, fellow soldiers lifted him onto a stretcher and rushed him to a place unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen, a Roman military hospital.
Water and clean linen now.
Inside, physicians carefully cleaned the wound, removed dirt and broken fragments, stitched the torn flesh with practiced hands, and wrapped it in clean linen. The days that followed were painful, but the soldier survived. Weeks later, he walked out of the hospital alive. In many parts of the world, he would have become another forgotten casualty. In Rome, he became another life saved through organization, discipline, and medical care. The Romans understood something revolutionary. A great doctor could save one patient, but a healthy city could save thousands. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome. Fresh water rushed into the city through towering stone aqueducts stretching for miles across the countryside. Families filled clay jars from public fountains. Waste disappeared beneath the streets through vast sewer systems instead of rotting outside people's homes. Public bathhouses welcomed citizens every day, making cleanliness a part of ordinary life rather than a luxury. The Romans had never seen a bacterium. They didn't know germs even existed. Yet through experience, they discovered a truth that medicine would not fully explain for nearly 2,000 years. Cleaner cities meant healthier people. Without realizing it, they had laid the foundations of public health. For generations, Rome became one of the most advanced societies the world had ever known. Medicine was improving, cities were cleaner, hospitals cared for the wounded. Humanity finally seemed to be gaining ground in its ancient battle against death. Then, everything began to fall apart. The mighty Roman Empire slowly collapsed. Aqueducts cracked and fell into ruin. Military hospitals closed their doors. Roads that had once connected continents became dangerous and abandoned. Trade declined. Knowledge stopped spreading. Many of the medical discoveries that had taken centuries to build were slowly forgotten. Europe entered a new age. Fear once again began replacing understanding. Old superstitions returned. Medical progress slowed almost to a standstill. It felt as though humanity had taken one giant step forward, only to be dragged several steps back. And while Europe struggled in the shadows of a fallen empire far beyond its borders, an invisible enemy had already begun a journey that would expose just how fragile medicine still was. When it finally arrived, it would kill millions, change the course of history, and force humanity to begin the fight against disease all over again. Nobody invited death into Europe. It arrived disguised as opportunity. Every day, merchant ships sailed into busy ports carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and goods from distant lands. To the people watching from the docks, they represented wealth, adventure, and prosperity. No one imagined that one of those ships was carrying something far more valuable and far more terrifying than its cargo. Long before anyone in Europe became sick, the plague had already begun moving, quietly, patiently. Somewhere in the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a tiny flea fed on an infected rodent. When that animal died, the flea found another host. Rats climbed aboard merchant caravans. Caravans reached crowded trading posts. More rats slipped onto ships preparing to cross the Mediterranean. The disease needed no army. It needed no king. It only needed people who believed they were carrying nothing more than ordinary cargo. For months, it traveled unnoticed across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas. With every mile, it crept closer to Europe. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody even knew it existed. Then, in October 1347, a fleet of merchant ships sailed into the busy harbor of Messina on the island of Sicily. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Crowds gathered along the docks, eager to unload expensive goods that had traveled thousands of miles. Merchants prepared their ledgers. Dock workers readied ropes and barrels. Business continued as it always had. Then the ships drifted close enough for people to see the decks. Silence spread through the harbor. Bodies lay where sailors had fallen. Some had died with their hands still gripping the rigging. Others remained slumped against barrels, motionless beneath the afternoon sun. The few who were still alive staggered toward the shore, barely able to stand. Their faces were pale, their bodies burned with fever. Large black swellings covered their necks, armpits, and groins. Some coughed blood onto the wooden docks before collapsing where they stood. The smell of death reached the harbor before the cargo did. The people of Messina had never witnessed anything like it. They had no name for the disease, no explanation, no treatment. They only knew that whatever had arrived on those ships did not look like any sickness they had ever seen. City officials ordered the ships to leave the harbor, but it was already too late. Rats had already escaped into the streets. Fleas had already found new hosts. The invisible enemy had stepped ashore. Within days, healthy families began falling ill. A father who had shared dinner with his children one evening was dead before the week was over. Neighbors stopped opening their doors. Church bells rang almost without pause. Graveyards filled faster than they could be dug. Fear spread even faster than the disease itself. For thousands of years, humanity had searched for ways to fight death. Now, death had come looking for humanity. The greatest medical crisis the world had ever seen had begun. At first, people believed the nightmare would end in Messina. A terrible sickness had arrived on a handful of foreign ships, and once those ships were gone, life would return to normal. It didn't. Weeks later, another merchant ship arrived in Genoa. Then another reached Marseille. Then Venice. Different ports. The same nightmare. Every captain believed he was delivering valuable cargo. Instead, every ship delivered death. Before long, the plague was racing along Europe's busiest trade routes, moving faster than any army ever could. Soon, the plague was no longer a distant rumor. It was outside people's front doors. Imagine waking up on a cold morning in the spring of 1348. Your neighbor, who had laughed with his children only yesterday, never opens his door. By afternoon, people whisper that he has a fever. The next day, a wooden cross appears on his house. No one dares to enter. No one dares to leave. Before the week is over, the church bell rings for his funeral. Then another bell rings, and another. Soon, they never seem to stop. The sickness always seemed to begin the same way. A fever, chills, crushing exhaustion. Then came the painful swellings beneath the arms, around the neck or in the groin. The lumps darkened as the infection spread through the body. Some victims began coughing blood. Others developed black patches across their skin as tissue died beneath the surface. Most who showed these signs never survived more than a few days. One young mother tucked her little son into bed after he complained that he felt cold. By sunrise, his fever was burning. 2 days later, she became sick herself. Neighbors were too frightened to enter the house. They left food outside the door and hurried away. Days later, both mother and son were carried from the home together. Neither would ever return. Stories like theirs unfolded thousands of times across Europe. Doctors stood beside dying patients with every remedy they knew. They opened veins to release what they believed was poisoned blood. They mixed herbs into bitter medicines. They burned sweet-smelling plants to cleanse the air. Priests prayed over the sick, believing God alone could stop the suffering. Families begged for miracles. None of it worked. The plague did not care whether you were a farmer or a nobleman, a merchant or a priest. It crossed every wall, entered every neighborhood, and knocked on every door. Rich and poor died alike. Kings lost subjects. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. Entire families disappeared within days. As the months passed, Europe itself began to change. Dogs wandered through silent streets, searching for owners who would never return. Market stalls stood exactly as they had the day before, their fruit rotting where merchants had once called out to customers. Fields were left untouched because there was no one alive to harvest them. In many towns, there were so many dead that survivors could no longer bury each person alone. Great mass graves were dug as quickly as workers could manage, yet even they struggled to keep up. For thousands of years, humanity had searched for ways to fight disease. The Egyptians had recorded treatments. Hippocrates had taught doctors to observe their patients. The Romans had built hospitals and cleaner cities. But none of it was enough. Humanity had been preparing for this battle for centuries, and it was still losing. By the time the Black Death finally began to fade, an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population had died. It was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. But in the ashes of that unimaginable tragedy, something unexpected began to emerge. The plague had exposed every weakness in medicine. It forced people to question old beliefs, search for better answers, and begin a journey that would eventually transform healthcare forever. The Black Death had not only changed the world, it had changed the future of medicine itself. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, the silence it left behind was almost as terrifying as the plague itself. Entire villages had vanished from the map. Empty homes stood abandoned. Fields that had once fed thousands were slowly reclaimed by weeds. Europe had survived, but it would never be the same again. For the first time in generations, people weren't just mourning the dead, they were asking difficult questions. Doctors looked back at everything they had tried, bloodletting, herbs, prayers, burning incense, and asked a painful question. If none of it worked, what had they misunderstood? If prayers alone couldn't stop the plague, why not? The Black Death had shattered centuries of certainty. Ideas that people had trusted for generations were no longer enough. Physicians became more determined to study disease instead of simply accepting old explanations. Cities slowly began realizing that cleanliness, isolation, and public health could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The next time suspicious ships appeared on the horizon, some Italian cities made a decision unlike anything before. They refused to let anyone come ashore. Crews were ordered to remain aboard their ships for 40 days before entering the city. If no one became sick during that time, they were finally allowed to land. That 40-day isolation became known as quarantino, the origin of the word quarantine. More than 600 years later, the same principle would still be used during global outbreaks, including the COVID-19 pandemic. Across Europe, a new generation refused to accept old answers simply because they were old. Scholars carefully recorded their observations. Physicians became more willing to question long-held beliefs. Universities placed greater importance on studying the human body, while knowledge spread more rapidly than ever before. Medicine was slowly changing from tradition into investigation, from inherited belief into evidence. The Black Death had taken millions of lives, but it had also left behind something even more powerful, a determination to understand disease instead of simply fearing it. Humanity had learned a painful lesson. Believing you understand an illness isn't enough. You have to prove it. Yet one mystery still remained. People still believed disease came from poisoned air, curses, or divine punishment. The real enemy was something no human being had ever seen. It was invisible, silent, living all around them. It would take another 500 years before someone finally proved what had been hiding in plain sight. And when that moment came, medicine would enter an entirely new age. The Black Death was over. Millions were dead, entire villages had disappeared, families had been torn apart, and Europe would never be the same. But after the mourning came one terrifying question. What had actually killed them? For centuries, doctors had treated wounds, studied the human body, and built hospitals. They had watched diseases spread through towns and kingdoms, yet they still had no idea what truly caused them. Humanity had spent thousands of years fighting an enemy it couldn't even see. Then, during the Renaissance, something extraordinary happened. Europe experienced a rebirth of curiosity. Artists, scientists, and physicians stopped accepting old ideas simply because they had been passed down for generations. They wanted proof. They wanted evidence. They wanted to see the truth with their own eyes. Inside a cold stone anatomy hall, a young medical student stood silently beside a human body. For centuries, many physicians had relied on ancient books instead of direct observation. But a growing number of scholars believed that if they truly wanted to save lives, they first had to understand the human body exactly as it was, not as others imagined it to be. Among them was Andreas Vesalius. Rather than repeating what earlier physicians had written, he performed careful dissections himself, muscle by muscle, bone by bone, organ by organ. What he discovered shocked the medical world. Many of the anatomical descriptions doctors had trusted for more than 1,000 years were wrong. Through careful observation, Vesalius rewrote humanity's understanding of the human body and proved a lesson that would shape science forever. Knowledge advances not by repeating old beliefs, but by testing them. Yet even with a better understanding of anatomy, one enormous mystery remained. Doctors could see bones, they could see muscles, they could see organs. But whatever had caused the Black Death, whatever had taken millions of lives throughout history, remained completely invisible. Then, in the 17th century, a Dutch cloth merchant named Antony van Leeuwenhoek picked up a tiny handcrafted microscope and adjusted its lens one final time. Curious about the world too small for the human eye to see, he placed a single drop of water beneath the glass. When he looked through the lens, he froze. The drop of water wasn't empty, it was alive. Tiny creatures twisted, darted, and swam in every direction. An entire hidden world had existed beside humanity since the beginning of time, yet no one had ever seen it before. Leeuwenhoek called them animalcules. Today, we know them as microorganisms. It was one of the greatest discoveries in human history. For the first time, people realized they shared the world with countless invisible forms of life. They were in water, in food, on everyday objects, and even on the human body itself. But one mystery still remained. Were these tiny organisms simply harmless living things? Or were they responsible for the diseases that had haunted humanity for thousands of years? The answer would come nearly 2 centuries later. In the 19th century, the French scientist Louis Pasteur conducted a series of remarkable experiments that changed medicine forever. He proved that microorganisms were real, that they caused fermentation and spoilage, and, most importantly, that many diseases were caused by living germs, not poisoned air, curses, or divine punishment. Soon afterward, the German physician Robert Koch took the next great step. He identified the specific bacteria responsible for deadly diseases such as anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. For the first time in history, humanity could point to its enemy by name. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. The Egyptians had unknowingly fought it. Hippocrates had searched for its patterns without ever seeing it. The Romans had slowed its spread by building cleaner cities. The victims of the Black Death had died without realizing what was attacking them. For more than 10,000 years, humanity had been fighting an invisible enemy without even knowing it existed. Now, at last, the enemy had a face. And once you can see your enemy, you can finally learn how to defeat it. For more than 10,000 years, humanity had fought disease without truly understanding its enemy. Entire civilizations had been devastated. The Black Death alone had claimed millions of lives, but now, for the first time in history, the battle was beginning to change. Humanity was no longer fighting blindly. It finally knew what it was fighting. The first great victory came in 1796. An English physician named Edward Jenner noticed something remarkable. Milkmaids who had been infected with the mild disease known as cowpox almost never caught smallpox, one of history's deadliest killers. Instead of ignoring the pattern, Jenner carefully tested his theory. It worked. His discovery became the world's first successful vaccine, proving that disease could be prevented before it ever had the chance to strike. A completely new chapter in medicine had begun. Over the decades that followed, vaccinations spread around the world. Diseases that had terrified entire civilizations slowly lost their grip. Then, in 1980, humanity achieved what had once seemed impossible. Smallpox, the disease that had killed hundreds of millions of people throughout history, was officially declared eradicated. For the first time, humanity had not merely survived one of its greatest enemies, it had completely defeated it. But medicine's greatest victories were only beginning. Nearly 70 years after Jenner's breakthrough, French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur proved that invisible microorganisms caused many diseases. His germ theory transformed medicine forever, replacing centuries of myths about poisoned air and curses with scientific evidence. Inspired by Pasteur's work, British surgeon Joseph Lister realized that if germs caused infection, surgeons had to stop those germs from entering wounds. By sterilizing instruments, cleaning surgical areas, and using antiseptics, Lister dramatically reduced deaths after surgery. Hospitals were no longer simply places where people waited to die. They were becoming places where people recovered. Not long afterward, German physician and microbiologist Robert Koch carried the revolution even further. Through painstaking research, he identified the exact bacteria responsible for deadly diseases such as anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. For the first time in history, doctors could identify specific organisms responsible for specific illnesses. Medicine had finally learned to identify its enemy by name. Then, in 1928, another breakthrough arrived almost by accident. Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming returned to his laboratory after a vacation and noticed that a common mold had killed the bacteria growing around it. Instead of throwing the contaminated experiment away, he investigated it. That simple observation led to the discovery of penicillin, the world's first true antibiotic. Infections that had killed people for thousands of years could suddenly be treated. Soldiers who once would have died from infected wounds survived. Children recovered from illnesses that had once been almost certain death. Millions of lives were saved because one scientist noticed what everyone else might have ignored. The pace of medical progress accelerated faster than ever before. Doctors learned to replace failing organs through transplantation. X-rays, CT scanners, and MRI machines allowed physicians to look inside the human body without making a single incision. Intensive care units gave critically ill patients a chance to recover. New medicines transformed diseases that had once been death sentences into conditions many people could live with for decades. Then, in the 21st century, humanity faced another global test. A new virus spread rapidly across the world, reminding everyone that the fight against disease was far from over. But this time, humanity did not face the crisis as it had during the Black Death. Scientists identified the virus within weeks, shared its genetic information across continents, and developed vaccines in record time. Researchers, doctors, and hospitals worked together on a scale the world had never seen before. The lessons learned over thousands of years were finally being put into action. Today, artificial intelligence helps doctors detect diseases earlier than ever before. Robotic systems assist surgeons with extraordinary precision. Researchers are exploring gene editing, personalized medicine, and treatments that may one day cure illnesses once thought impossible to overcome. The battle continues. But humanity no longer fights in darkness. 10,000 years ago, our ancestors searched forests for healing plants, hoping they might survive another day. Today, we decode DNA, replace failing organs, and design medicines that target diseases with astonishing precision. The fight against death is not over. But for the first time in human history, humanity is winning. 10,000 years ago, the man from the beginning of our story died from a simple wound because humanity didn't yet know how to save him. During the Black Death, millions more lost their lives because the world still couldn't see the invisible enemy it was fighting. But generation after generation, humanity refused to surrender. Every mistake became a lesson. Every discovery became a step forward. Slowly, the impossible became possible. Diseases that once wiped out entire civilizations can now often be prevented, treated, or even eliminated. Our fight against disease isn't over. New illnesses will emerge, new challenges will test us. But unlike our ancestors, we no longer fight in the dark. And the next medical breakthrough may come from someone watching this video today. The history of medicine isn't just the story of doctors or hospitals, it's the story of humanity's determination to survive. Now I'd love to hear your opinion. Which single medical breakthrough do you think changed human history the most? And is there one I didn't mention that deserves to be on this list? Let me know in the comments.